All right, we should be recording. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. If you're here for our acoustics theory and soundscape ecology in Alaska's wilderness for our free Wildlife Wednesday. Next slide, please. So just a few guidelines that will help us make this a little bit more seamless. Obviously, no Zoom bombing. And Tim had said go into the thumbnail mode, I think you said, Tim, to better view every slide and to get the whole slide picture. So go ahead and try that. We usually encourage viewing on full screen mode, but he's right, that ends up kind of sometimes blocking some things. We typically wait till the end of the presentation for questions. However, I'm going to moderate the questions. So if you could, as we're going along, put whatever questions that you have in the chat box and I'll keep track of them. And at the end of the presentation, I'll try and watch to see what's been answered, what hasn't been answered, and kind of try and moderate some of that. If your question doesn't get answered, then just go ahead and towards the end and come back on and go ahead and ask it. Next slide. So Alaska Wildlife Alliance is an Alaskan-based nonprofit protecting Alaska's wildlife since 1978. And we do this through citizen mobilization, advocacy, and education like this Wildlife Wednesday. Next slide. We act as voices for wildlife, just kind of fighting to increase. One of our main focuses, for example, is fighting to increase non-consumptive representation on Alaska's Board of Game. Education and outreach, we do a lot of different things, including the Wildlife Wednesdays. And then we're part of many different conservation coalitions and partnerships with advocacy groups that support wildlife across the state. Next slide. One of the things that we have been working on this year, and many of you may have attended our Trapping Wildlife Wednesday back, I believe it was in September. One of the things we're trying to do is just focusing on making trapping in Alaska more safe. And Alaska doesn't have any requirements currently that trappers report where their traps are. And that ends up being an issue throughout Alaska in terms of hikers and their dogs and their children and that sort of thing. So this year we initiated a program called Map the Trap. And so if you know where there are traps, let us know where they are, and we're simply tracking it. We're simply tracking it in a format where people can come on then again and look to see where traps are and where they might not be. Go ahead, next slide. As many of you know, the Alaska Wildlife Alliance is one of the host partners to the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Project. I am their liaison to their project, and I'm happy to announce that our spring monitoring season began on March 15th. It started on Monday. We haven't seen any belugas down here yet. It happens throughout the Cook Inlet, but we need volunteers. So if you're down here or even down in Homer, we have a lot of people drive up from Homer and are interested at all in volunteering to monitor, go out to akbmp.org and sign up to be a volunteer. All you have to do is watch their video, and then you come out with a lead beluga monitor and kind of get signed off on what you're supposed to do in the paperwork that you have to fill out. Another fun thing that we do for the Kenai and the Kasilof rivers is we have a text system that will let you know if somebody has seen belugas on either of those two rivers on any given day. And so if you text the word beluga, B-E-L-U-G-A, to this phone number, 833-541-0408, it'll come back and it'll tell you that you're signed up for the system. What happens at that point is that if any of the monitors are out there and they're seeing belugas, they let me know, and then I send out a text alert. Or if they let Mandy Magura, who's our deputy director, know, we send out a text alert saying that a beluga has been seen on one of the rivers. And it just kind of lets everybody know when we're starting to see belugas and how often. And once you're signed up for it, if you're the one that's out there and you see belugas, all you have to do is text back to that same number and the message comes to either me or Mandy, and then we send out the alert. And last year it was really fun. We had alerts almost every day for the fall season. Next slide. And Wildlife Wednesdays are one of our big mainstays. So next month, we have another Wildlife Wednesday coming up. It'll be on April 21st, and it's from 7 to 8 p.m. again. And it's going to be Todd Eskelin, and he's going to talk about hummingbird banding on the Kenai Peninsula. And I have to say that I did not know that we had such a huge hummingbird population on the Kenai Peninsula, and that they actually overwinter here. We have some of the toughest hummingbirds in the world, I expect. Anyway, that's next month. Go ahead, next slide. Right, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Timothy Mullet is the ecologist for the Kenai Fjords National Park. Dr. Mullet has focused his work in ecoacoustics for nearly 10 years, with an emphasis on understanding ecological patterns, evaluating wilderness quality, and measuring the impacts of human disturbance. His published works range from producing the first map of a winter soundscape in Alaska to the award-winning Acoustic Hypothesis. He lives happily nestled among the coastal mountains in Seward, Alaska, with his wife, Amanda. Dr. Mullet, thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Teresa. And I want to thank you all for coming. And I appreciate the opportunity AWA has given me to speak today. I'm really excited to tell you all about this exciting new field of ecoacoustics and soundscape ecology. This is surprisingly a very broad field, but my hope is to show you some of the work I have done specifically focused in Alaska. There's people working on this all over the world. My presentation has three major parts. I'll start by explaining some of the foundational theories used in the field of ecoacoustics and how those relate to the real world. I'll then present the results of my work in the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, where I studied the acoustic impacts of snowmobiles. I will then finish with some preliminary results from a study I am conducting at Kenai Fjords National Park, looking at the indirect effects of COVID-19 on wildlife communities. What I really want you to take away from this is that sound is very important to natural and human environments, and our use of machines is creating a real problem to the disappearance of our natural sounds. But my hope is that you'll gain a new appreciation and awareness of these issues to help preserve these precious resources. Sound has been around on Earth for a very long time. Geophysical sounds made by Earth have existed for over 4 billion years. Animal production of sounds are said to have evolved 400 million years ago, and more than likely, sound was used by animals long before that. Human-made noise from machines has existed for over 300 years, starting with steam engines, then graduating to internal combustion engines. Today, sound is produced or used by all animals, including humans in some form. And these three forms of geophysical sounds, biological sounds, and noise are present in nearly every terrestrial, aquatic, and marine system. In human environments, noise is everywhere, and we often assume there are places that still exist on Earth where noise does not have an effect. Although this may be true to some degree, we are losing natural sounds, and areas that were once pristine systems full of animal choruses, Earth activities, among other natural things, are now gone forever because of noise pollution. The fact is evident: noise is a human-made problem because of our prolific use of machines, which have taken us to every corner of the Earth. The three main sources that are causing the largest problems of noise pollution globally are road traffic, air traffic, and sea traffic. Although I will explain later that off-road vehicles like snowmobiles have significant impacts as well. Okay, I'm going to hit you with some statistics, and I want you to pay attention to the maps, specifically how much of the Earth is impacted by noise from just these three sound sources. The Earth is covered by 65 million miles of road traveled by over 1.4 billion cars. There are 176,000 operating commercial flights a day worldwide, conducted by 26,000 commercial planes, and US flights alone cover 15% of Earth's surface. There are 54,000 commercial sea vessels worldwide that cover over 60,000 miles of ocean per year. On top of this, the US has over 12 million small boats that cover both marine and freshwater environments. As you might have noticed, there are very few places these three sources of noise have not affected. But this significant expansion of noise in the environment also comes at a time when we are losing our biological sources of sound. This map shows the current percent loss of biodiversity on Earth. Of the species we know are producers and users of biological sound, including amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, fish, and invertebrates, over 6,000 species are on the verge of extinction. The combination of human-made noise and loss of biodiversity is having a dramatic effect on the natural sounds of Earth. It is too late for us to go back in time when the world around us was exclusively natural sounds. Noise is here to stay, and it has significant meaning to how natural systems operate these days. So what we really need to ask is, what is the ecological role of sound? How does sound affect animal behaviors, and what does sound mean for humans? Ecoacoustics is a scientific field that was established in 2014 to simply combine all other fields that attempt to answer these questions under one common umbrella. Currently, published literature addressing ecoacoustic subjects has increased significantly from just a handful of papers in the 1990s to over 100 publications a year since 2018. So sound has become a very important subject in the science community. In the field of physics, sound is a very complex phenomenon, but in the animal kingdom, all sound really is information. Animals are cognizant of the environment because we possess sensory organs that enable us to interact with each other and the things around us. We can conceptualize sound as a source of information that is nested in with all other ecological information that can be perceived by our senses. We call this arena of information in nature the echo field. The acoustic echo field entails all acoustic information and noise in the environment. It is safe to say that the acoustic echo field is vital to those species that have evolved to make and use sounds to survive. Wildlife use and make sounds in nature to communicate, select habitats, locate prey, and assess risks. If this critical information is unavailable or interrupted in the acoustic echo field, it is impossible for animals to be successful. When approaching the ecological role of sound, there really are two systems that we are working in: natural systems and human systems. In natural systems, sounds play a role in the ways animals behave, how communities interact, and how ecosystems maintain their integrity and function. Sound also plays out in nature at broader spatial scales, creating a matrix of sounds across the landscape in the form of soundscapes. In human systems, sound plays a role in the psychological and physiological aspects of how we perceive and interpret our surroundings and our relationships. This is what often affects our sense of solitude and connection with nature. There are also the human cultural aspects of sound with our expression and enjoyment of things like music. In many cases, sounds like music provide us a sense of identity. And biologically, the sound of our own voice also identifies who we are to others. Sound also gives us a sense of place. The sound of church bells, trains, or the ocean may be part of our sense of place. And then humans generate noise that has become a significant issue where natural and human systems intersect. Sounds are generally categorized into three components. Biophony are those sounds by non-human biological organisms. Geophony are those sounds made by the activities of the earth, like the sounds of rain, wind, and rushing water. Anthropophony are all those sounds made by humans, with technophony being a subcategory for the sounds made by our use of technology. We commonly refer to this as noise. Now let's look at how these sound components fit within the context of the environment. Focus your attention on this picture as nothing more than what you see. We see mountains, grass, glaciers, trees, and clouds. Now, if we simplify this landscape into a checkerboard, where the patterns of these visual attributes exist, the area of this landscape where sound occurs is called the acoustic space, and the sonic information within the acoustic space is the acoustic echo field. Sounds in nature have a nested hierarchy that is based on the scale of interest. To visualize the hierarchy of sounds in space, let's start with that pattern landscape with an empty acoustic space. At the smallest scale, we can begin filling in the acoustic space with a song of a single species of bird. As we increase the scale, the single species becomes a part of a group of other sound producing species, creating what we call an acoustic community. As we broaden our horizons, the sounds of biophony, geophony, and technophony fill a localized space known as a sonotope. Here we begin to see patterns emerge in space and sound. At the full landscape scale, we can see the variety of acoustic compositions created by a matrix of sounds, acoustic communities, and sonotopes that create the fully occupied soundscape. At this level, we can see true patterns in the landscape where sounds are associated with physical organisms, geophysical events, and human activity. To understand why noise is so detrimental to natural soundscapes, we must first understand some basic concepts about biophony and its importance to wildlife. Soniferous, or sound-producing species, use the acoustic space and acoustic echo field in many ways. The acoustic niche hypothesis suggests that animals call at specific times and frequencies in the acoustic space to avoid competition with other sounds, so they rely on the availability of an acoustic niche to be heard. The soundscape orientation hypothesis has found that animals also use the sounds made by other organisms, both within the same species as well as other species, to orient themselves towards resources such as safe migration stopovers and foraging habitats. And the acoustic habitat hypothesis suggests that animals also require specific arrangements of biophony, geophony, and technophony to select habitats where they can be successful. So let's talk about the acoustic niche hypothesis a little bit. Here we see a spectrogram with frequency on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. The pink and blue smudges are the visualizations of sounds made by many species in an acoustic community in the Amazon. The intensity of colors indicates how loud the sounds are. What we see here are distinct horizontal and vertical bands where sounds of distinct species occur in the acoustic space. In this example, I could personally detect about 7 to 8 different species calling at the same time, but at different frequencies and time intervals. And I have a very trained ear for things like this because I've spent a lot of time listening to the environment. When we listen to this recording, pay very close attention if you can to hear all the different species from many different types of frogs at lower frequencies and a myriad of insects at higher frequencies. What this frequency partitioning exemplifies is that in some ecosystems with high biodiversity, sound-producing species use acoustic niches to avoid competition with other species. The importance of this is twofold. One, the identity and number of species can be detected and interpreted by anyone from the occupied amounts of acoustic space. And two, an acoustic niche must be vacant in order for it to be utilized. This is where noise becomes an issue. Because the acoustic space and information that is available in the acoustic echo field is so important to wildlife, I conceptualized all of this into a working hypothesis called the acoustic habitat hypothesis, which states that sound-dependent species select habitats based on their acoustic qualities. And this is based on an animal's ability to call and hear at specific frequencies. So not every species can make sounds at all frequencies, and not every species can hear at all frequencies. There's also the presence of competitors and predators, and the composition of biophony, geophony, and anthropophony in sonotopes where animals seek to reside is also a factor. What this hypothesis highlights is that the acoustic environment is an important aspect of an animal's success in addition to the physical resources it also requires. One of the more interesting aspects of this hypothesis is that we can conceptualize the way animals are distributed in the landscape based on their occupancy and the way sounds are distributed in the environment. Here we have a rectangle representing the acoustic space and the proportion of that area of which is occupied by biophonies, technophonies, and geophonies that are spread across natural sonotopes, a rural sonotope, and an urban sonotope. We can assume that a higher diversity of sound-dependent species are present in natural sonotopes, emitting higher proportions of biophony. And as we move into the rural environments developed by humans, the proportion of biophonies and technophonies become intermixed until we reach fully developed urban sonotopes where animal diversity and biophony is lowest and technophony is the dominant soundscape feature. My hypothesis also suggests that there are species that can be considered acoustic habitat specialists and generalists. In a natural sonotope, we have a higher number of acoustic habitat specialists, where there is a higher diversity of sounds occupied by animals within acoustic niches. In rural sonotopes, we have a fewer number of specialists that compete with the non-biological sounds of geophony and technophony. But there also exists some species that are more generally adapted to both natural and rural sonotopes. On the far end of the spectrum in urban sonotopes, there are indeed some species that are unique acoustic habitat specialists for urban sonotopes. They are well adapted over other species to compete with the din of technophony. Some of these species may include European house finches and rock doves. But we can also find that some species may be capable of occupying both rural and urban sonotopes, for example, European starlings and blackbirds. And finally, we have the broader acoustic habitat generalists that can occupy all three of these sonotopes without an issue. Some species of this kind may include ravens, crows, and thrushes, among many other species. Some of the key benefits of the acoustic habitat hypothesis are that it connects the acoustic environment to the physical environment and its inhabitants. It also suggests that the composition of sounds in a sonotope can drive evolutionary adaptations, which has actually been documented in frogs and birds that have evolved physically and acoustically to noisy environments. Because the physical and acoustic environment are closely intertwined, the study of sound also allows us to identify acoustic environmental relationships, assess the quality of our wilderness areas through acoustic metrics, measure the response of wildlife communities like climate change and development, and it allows us to understand the impacts human activity has on natural systems that are well beyond the soundscape itself. Now, that was my overview of ecoacoustics and soundscape ecology, so you should all feel like experts on the subject at this point. I'm going to switch gears now and present to you a published chapter of my dissertation where I investigated how noise from snowmobiles affects the wilderness of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. Nothing is more wild and remote in the hearts and minds of Americans than Alaska. Located on the Kenai Peninsula in south central Alaska, the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge is 2 million acres of Alaska in miniature, possessing almost every ecosystem that can be found in the state. The refuge manages 1.3 million acres of this land as congressionally designated wilderness, which under the Wilderness Act of 1964 requires managers to keep these areas in their most natural state, where people can truly enjoy an experience of solitude in an undeveloped natural environment. However, the Alaska Natural Interest Lands Conservation Act of 1980, which established the refuge and its wilderness, allows snowmobiling for traditional activities in wilderness units. What is clear is that the presence of snowmobiles and the noise they create in wilderness is contradictory to the preserving its naturalness and experience of solitude in nature. But this is the law, and it's important to know how these conflicting mandates to allow snowmobiles in wilderness affect the naturalness and solitude of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. To understand this, we must first understand winter soundscapes. Winter is a very quiet time of year where much of the biophony is reduced and the sounds of liquid water in summer turn to the muted sounds of snow and frozen streams. The natural quiet of winter is important to wildlife and naturalness because it provides perfect conditions for animals to rest and hibernate. Natural quiet also reduces stress to animals that are already struggling to survive in a stressful winter environment. Additionally, natural quiet allows resources to be easily heard and identified because acoustic information is more rare. For humans, natural quiet provides people with a unique acoustic experience. It is uncommon for us to experience naturally quiet areas within our developed world. Natural quiet in wilderness areas can create a sense of true solitude of internal and external quiet for those who visit. But the abrasive noise of snowmobiles can degrade these wilderness qualities, having both significant impacts on natural processes and human experience. To study the acoustic footprint of snowmobile noise in the Kenai Wilderness soundscape, I recorded sounds for 1 minute every 30 minutes between December 2011 and April 2012 at 27 sites in wilderness and 37 sites outside of wilderness. I listened to about 60,000 sound recordings and identified natural quiet recordings as those with biophony and periods of subtle geophony free from any kind of noise. I also identified recordings with snowmobile noise. I then converted the recordings to spectrograms like the ones you see here, and I calculated the amount of sound energy within 1 kilohertz frequency bands known as soundscape power. I summarized soundscape power over the 5 months I sampled and 24-hour days to see what patterns emerged from these sound sources. I took the average soundscape power of natural quiet and snowmobile noise at each sound station and overlaid those spatial points with 16 environmental variables. I used machine learning to find the relationships between these acoustic events and environmental variables. These known relationships allowed me to generate a map where these acoustic environmental relationships occurred in the soundscape. When looking at the soundscape of snowmobile noise and natural quiet over monthly timeframes, snowmobile noise was relatively low in the months of December, January, and April, but spiked during February and March when there was more daylight and snow conditions were stabilized by colder temperatures. Natural quiet, on the other hand, showed signs of relatively high soundscape power related to some biophonic activity in December, February, and April, and a smaller rise in March. January exhibited the quietest time of the year. Over 24-hour periods, I found that high values of soundscape power associated with snowmobile noise and biophony had overlapping periods of activity. This was most likely due to people and animals using daylight for their daily activities. However, we can see that the quietest periods occurred when snowmobile noise and biophony were not present during the evening hours. Out of the 16 environmental variables I used for my models, I found that snowmobile noise was predominantly associated with areas closer to rivers, lakes, and wetlands, which makes sense because these landscape features are perfect for snowmobiling. There is also a strong relationship to off and on-trail snowmobiling sites, which indicates snowmobile noise was associated with well-established trails as well as remote settings in wilderness areas. What I thought was interesting was that natural quiet displayed the opposite relationships to the same landscape features used by snowmobiles, namely areas further from snowmobile trails, rivers, and off-trail snowmobile hotspots. What was equally interesting was natural quiet was also associated with areas further from oil and gas compressors and urban development. This provides a great confirmation that natural quiet primarily occurred in areas where human activity from machines did not exist. I think one of the coolest things about the machine learning method I used was that the acoustic environmental relationships I just mentioned allowed me to make a map that predicted where all these relationships come together in wilderness and non-wilderness areas. On the left is a map predicting the spatial distribution of snowmobile noise in wilderness and non-wilderness, with red displaying hotspots of snowmobile noise. On the right is a map predicting the spatial distribution of natural quiet, with purples highlighting hotspots of the quietest regions of the refuge. When I overlapped these two maps, I focused only on the hotspots of snowmobile noise and natural quiet. I was able to create a new map of these hotspots where I could calculate the total area of wilderness affected by snowmobile noise and how much of that wilderness remained naturally quiet. Snowmobile noise in wilderness is in red and non-wilderness areas are in pink, while natural quiet in wilderness is in dark purple and non-wilderness in light purple. Based on this analysis, I found that snowmobile noise impacted 44% of non-wilderness areas and 39% of wilderness areas where snowmobiling was allowed. But I also found that snowmobile noise extended into nearly 30,000 acres of wilderness where snowmobiling was prohibited, despite there being no physical presence of snowmobiling. Natural quiet made up only 18% of non-wilderness and 36% of wilderness open to snowmobiling. But in wilderness where snowmobiling is prohibited, natural quiet occurred over 64% of those areas. Overall, a little more than half of Kenai National Wildlife Refuge wilderness was dominated by natural quiet. And these areas were predominantly located where snowmobiles were not allowed to go or unable to go, such as interior forest habitats and the Kenai Mountains in the eastern border. The real significance of these findings is that the use of snowmobiles in wilderness creates a fragmented soundscape with a patchwork of noisy sonotopes in a landscape where natural quiet would most likely be more continuous. Even though snowmobile noise is ephemeral in nature, the unpredictability and extent their noise can impact wilderness changes that quiet, stress-free soundscape for wildlife and certainly alters human experience of solitude. Although there is clear evidence that snowmobiling has degrading effects to wilderness areas, snowmobilers are not doing so insidiously. Rather, every person who utilizes a machine to recreate in Alaska's wilderness is doing so in some form to enjoy its beauty and escape from the development of their everyday lives. Alaska's wilderness is very difficult to access, but it is so attractive for our recreation that we have employed nearly every machine possible to access and experience its magnificence. This is what I call the Alaska Conundrum. We use machines to access and enjoy wilderness, but by using machines in these wild landscapes, we degrade its naturalness and diminish the quality of our true wilderness experience. Yet because many people have brought noise to the front lines of wilderness issues, there are many opportunities now to use quieter vehicles for our outdoor activities. And of course, traditional and non-motorized activities are still available. Okay. All right. So I'm going to switch gears one last time onto my third topic and tell you about an ongoing study I have been working on in the Kenai Fjords National Park, investigating the link between the coronavirus pandemic and wildlife behavior. When the pandemic hit the US about a year ago now, I wanted to jump on the opportunity to investigate whether its impacts would have any effect on wildlife in the park. Coming at this question with an ecoacoustics perspective seemed like an excellent opportunity to create a scientific study with the deductive reasoning that COVID-19 cases and deaths would create travel restrictions. Travel restrictions would reduce park visitation. Reduced park visitation would mean a reduction in vehicle traffic. Reduction in vehicle traffic would reduce road noise, which may create a response in the biophony of acoustic communities in the park. Now, I am sure you have read many anecdotal pandemic stories of wildlife reclaiming normally human-occupied areas, and even reports of some areas where natural sounds are more present than noise. While these are fun things to think about, truly understanding the relationship between a deadly pandemic that has significantly changed human behavior and how wildlife respond to this change takes a more rigorous approach. I committed to studying this topic for, forgot the sound there. I committed to studying this topic for 3 years with the assumption that year one in 2020 would mark the baseline of the highest travel restrictions, lowest visitation, and most natural acoustic conditions. While subsequent years, I expected human activity to slowly return to pre-COVID conditions. The focal area of my study was the Exit Glacier developed area. The reason for this was that Kenai Fjords National Park is over 669,000 acres of roadless wilderness, predominantly covered by the Harding Ice Field and over 400 miles of coastline. The Exit Glacier area in this circle is the only road accessible area of the park, consisting of 2,222 acres of post-glacier ecosystems. It's a very popular area for visitors, where in 2019, pre-COVID conditions, Exit Glacier received over 350,000 visitors that used 60,000 vehicles to enter the park. Whereas in 2020, visitor numbers dropped to nearly 116,000 and less than 30,000 vehicles. This was more than a 67% reduction in visitors and vehicles during the first summer of the pandemic. One of the critical aspects of this study was understanding the contribution and significance of vehicle noise to acoustic communities in this region. As you see in this spectrogram taken from a recording at Exit Glacier on June 15th, 2020 at 9:30 a.m., you can also hear there is an obvious acoustic community at mid to high frequencies and geophony from rushing water at low frequencies. At about 15 seconds into this recording, a car passes by. This single car masks the natural sounds that are present but are no longer audible. It is this masking effect of noise that can have detrimental impacts to acoustic habitats and wildlife behavior. but with lower visitor numbers and vehicle traffic, this effect may be less evident during the pandemic. To study this, I sampled 10 locations based on their location to the road, parking lot, and lower trails in the Exit Glacier developed area. I created replicate sound stations at 50, 175, and 400 meters from the road and parking area to see if I could detect any possible acoustic footprint from road noise. I started sampling 8 days prior to the vehicle gate being open on May 20th and 32 days following the gate closing on October 22nd. I used a vehicle counter to count the number of vehicles entering the park as a key variable to compare with acoustic data to determine road traffic effect on the soundscape. Sound data were converted to spectrograms and soundscape power was calculated again at the 1 kilohertz frequency intervals. I segmented soundscape power into low frequency values between 1 to 2 kilohertz because it is a common frequency of technophony, and mid to high frequency values between 2 and 11 kilohertz, which are common frequencies for biophony. Geophony is mixed in with pretty much everything. From this, I calculated the normalized difference soundscape index to calculate the weight of importance of low frequency to mid to high frequency sounds at Exit Glacier. This provides values between +1 and -1. Positive NDSI values indicate greater biophony and lesser technophony. And negative NDSI values indicate greater technophony and lesser biophony. So here's a quick view of the study area where recorders were set up and the traffic counter was placed. I made sure to choose points north of the road to avoid any kind of noise effect from the exit creek, which can get pretty noisy at times and cause problems with our recorders. So with this graph, pay close attention to how this is set up. So this is the figure shows NDSI values on the vertical axis that says acoustic index, and on the horizontal axis we have the period that the park gate to vehicles was closed in the springtime, open during the summer, and closed in the fall. And the red line indicates the 0 value, where positive values above the line indicate more biophony and negative values below the line indicate more technophony. We see by this distinctively that positive values were indicated before and after the gate opening, and significantly negative values were present during the gate, while the gate was open. If we look at soundscape values according to distance from the road, the top 2 graphs show the difference between low frequency values and mid to high frequency values, with sites at 50 and 175 meters having significantly higher values of low frequency noise than at 400 meters, while the 400 meter site has significantly higher values mid to high frequency sounds. What this is showing with the NDSI figure at the bottom is that similar negative values were indicative of 50 and 175 meters, and significantly positive values at 400 meters. This is NDSI by month and by distance. In May, NDSI values were all positive and similar at all 3 distances. NDSI increased in June at 400 meters, but decreased at 50 and 175 meters, but still remained positive. Positive May and June values were predominantly associated with songbird choruses and intermittent days of rain. But in July and August, all values at all distances dropped dramatically, with negative values at 50 and 175 meters lasting even till November. What is notable is that values at 400 meters remained positive throughout the season. In November, NDSI at all three distances increased to high positive values, which was actually more indicative of rainy weather rather than bird songs. When I graphed a regression curve to see the relationship between NDSI on the vertical axis and study day on the horizontal axis, they all showed this inverse parabolic relationship during midsummer. But the regression curve only dipped to negative values at 50 and 175 meter sites starting on June 6th and extending up to October 20th and 22nd. Around the same time the gate is open. Although NDSI dropped at 400 meters during the same time period, NDSI values remained positive throughout the season, indicating a higher amount of biophony than the other two sites. If we look at NDSI in relationship to 24-hour time frames for each distance, we find a parabolic relationship at all three distances, with higher values at all three sites during the better part of the day. In this case, the negative NDSI values at the early and late hours of the day were indicative of natural quiet, where there were virtually little to no sounds detected, but there were low frequency sounds of wind and water. But when comparing these distances, that rise in the curve indicates that biophony doesn't start occurring at 50 and 175 meters until about 7 a.m. and marginally lasting till 6 p.m. Yet at 400 meter sites, the arch is much higher and lasts much longer, with NDSI values associated with biophony starting around 2 in the morning and lasting till 11 at night. If we take a closer look at NDSI over hourly timeframes by month, what we see is distinctive positive values associated with the dawn chorus spiking in the morning in May and June for all three distances. NDSI values remain high over the day at 400 meters in July and August, but all values really begin to truncate around the 0 mark in September and October, which I think shows that that autumn has more of a balance of sounds across frequencies than it does at other times of the year. But by November, all NDSI values increase to positive and are basically unrecognizable from another. And I did a lot of listening to sound recordings during this time of year to see what was going on. And this is actually a very clear indicator of rain that is audible at mid to high frequency sounds. So it will produce positive values. So you see the variation of biophony and technophony over these monthly timeframes and hourly intervals. Now, looking at vehicle traffic, we see the same rise in vehicle counts from May to August, followed by a fall in October. Over weekdays, we see a rise in vehicle counts on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And over 24-hour timeframes, we see that most vehicle activity is during the mid part of the day with a peak around lunchtime. If we look at the relationship between NDSI on the vertical axis and vehicle count by distance on the horizontal axis, we see that NDSI actually trends downward with increased vehicle traffic, but it appears that low frequency sounds mostly dominate the soundscape of 50 and 175 meters from the road, and technophony associated with vehicle noise increases those negative values of NDSI with increasing traffic. What I think is interesting is that at 400 meters, we actually see a rise in biophony with vehicle counts between 0 and 20 vehicle passes every 30 minutes, which is largely associated with the early season of bird choruses in May and June, associated with lower vehicle traffic earlier in the season. But as the vehicle count increases to 22 vehicles per 30 minutes, NDSI begins to fall. And at 44 vehicle passes per 30 minutes and higher, we see a steep decline of NDSI into negative values, which is a strong indication that vehicle noise creates an acoustic footprint up to 400 meters from the road when vehicle traffic reaches 44 vehicles or more per every 30 minutes. These relationships can be seen in more detail with the period the vehicle gate is open in this bottom right-hand graph. Some notable highlights from this preliminary results are that the exit glacier area experienced less than 33% of its normal vehicle numbers in 2020 compared to 2019. There are distinct temporal patterns and spatial differences in the soundscape at varying distances from the road and parking area. Biophony appears to be more dominant at further distances from the road than closer to the road. And technophony associated with vehicle traffic is regularly detectable at distances even up to 175 meters. However, technophony from vehicle traffic can still affect the acoustic communities up to 400 meters from the road when vehicle passes are greater than 44 cars per 30 minutes. Travel restrictions associated with the pandemic did indeed reduce visitation, but whether acoustic communities behave differently as a result of this is unclear. With the dissemination of vaccines, reduced travel restrictions, and the world's aggressive plans to get our lives back to normal, time will tell if these results will change in 2021 and 2022. But I think we have found like a great baseline to start for comparison. Sound has been an ecological driver of evolution for over 4 billion years. And the noise we have generated over the last 300 years is now expansive and pervasive across the earth. Nevertheless, sound remains vital to wildlife ecosystem function. But the profound connection between humans and nature cannot be undone, and there is strong evidence that sound is an important part of this relationship. Unfortunately, because sound is so important to life on Earth, the noise we make that bears no semblance of meaning in nature has compounding impacts with climate change and habitat destruction that are driving the extinction of species and our natural soundscapes. So much so that the wild soundscapes we hear today will cease to exist in the future. These results have a very personal and significant effect on the human experience and connection with our natural world. And although it seems we can't escape from our machine-oriented life, we must be aware that it comes at a cost. At the very least, we must draw an awareness to our own soundscape, to grow an appreciation of its significance in the world, and make individual choices to reduce our acoustic footprint and find ways as a society to preserve our natural sounds and prevent these fragments of extinction. Thank you all for listening.
Tim, Dr. Mullet, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a fantastic presentation. Gosh, it's very clear that you put a lot of work into it. So I have a list of questions. And so let me, first of all, people are putting in the chat box how amazing some of your recordings were, particularly the Amazon frogs recording.
Yeah, I didn't take that one, unfortunately.
Carol asks if you have been able to measure or if you know of studies that are measuring the effects of jet skis on marine life. As you know, I think they've just allowed jet skis into Kachemat Bay.
Yeah, that issue has just been brought to my attention. I knew I don't know of any specific studies off the top of my head because I haven't gone into that world of interest. It is, I know it's a problem, but to what extent, I don't know. And it sounds like it's like if folks can start studying it here, it can be a pretty important contribution to the literature.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and I would add to that, because your hypothesis and your research is generally looking at the broader view and the totality of sound that's happening. What has happened since 2014 in terms of research projects that you're aware of that are looking at specific species or groups of species?
Oh, let me, at least bird songs are very distracting. So, um, I just want to relax and lay down and listen to that, you know. So there's because of my interests are more of a broad ecological aspect of ecoacoustics. I kind of stay in that world a lot of the time, but there is a significant amount of literature out there and developing literature on uh, noise impacts to individual species as well as groups of species, and just doing the right search in something like Google Scholar or Web of Science, or even on the even just a general Google search on the internet about that topic. You could pull up, you might not pull up necessarily specific published literature, but you'd pull up a lot of articles from articles that are kind of highlighting scientists who are addressing those subjects.
I can imagine it's becoming a very big field very quickly.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Oh yeah, sure. I've got actually got a friend of mine sent me a paper about you know, bioacoustics, which is more geared towards what we were talking about as single species impacts, and then ecoacoustics, which is the broad ecological aspects. That the number of publications on that is just skyrocketing right now. It's become a very important issue, and I'm
So
really happy that folks are tuning into this.
yes, yeah, absolutely. So Ed asks, so do you think we will ever direct management decisions to reflect your observations? I have long cursed the motorboat and snow machine use below Ski Lac Lake most of the winter,
Yeah.
especially as related to the increasing number of swans using the swan sanctuary each year.
So, you know, from my direct experience, I know for a fact they're not planning to use sound as a management tool. And one of the things with I know that specifically at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, and we've talked about at Kenai, here at Kenai Fjords National Park, we know we're not going to probably not reduce, like if we find a significant impact of noise to the environment at Exit Glacier, I seriously doubt we'll do anything to mitigate that by reducing the number of cars that come into Exit Glacier. But one of the things that we have talked about is, first of all, understanding what the impact is, if anything, is that's the first thing. And then two, like if the park itself does any type of development projects or things that we can incorporate what we've learned about the soundscape into you know, NEPA compliance and other mitigation tools to reduce noise impacts to the environment. It's not an easy thing to use as a management tool.
I can see that. I can see that. So Mike Coffeen has a couple of questions. He asks first, did any part of your study or analysis include noise from planes or aircraft that go over the refuge?
Yeah, so I had those data, and the since my dissertation was so focused on was specifically focused on snow machines, that Kenai National Wildlife Refuge had a management plan that asked the question of what is the impact of snow machines on the refuge. And so I was kind of brought on as a doctoral student to answer those questions. And I had looked at the amount of plane noise that is out there, and I didn't delve too deep into it, other than the fact that I found that I sampled I sampled over 64 locations, and every single one of them had a plane in it, at least one. And so it's the fact that you can go to some of the most remote locations on the Kenai Peninsula and still hear a plane is, I think, is fairly significant in my mind. But my hard drive crashed, and I lost lost those recordings, unfortunately.
And then Mike's second question is, noise from a single source, i.e. vehicles, aircraft, can vary significantly because of increased air density, such as cold winter air, and also because of seasonal vegetative changes. Are there any management implications based on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important aspect of how sound attenuates across the landscape. And I think one of the things we try to do when we measure that, but of course there's people who are doing more advanced sound recordings than I am. But I think one of the things we try to do is standardize all our methodology and repeat and do as many replicates as possible. Um, in order to get a better sample, because it's very hard to measure. I've never tried to measure barometric pressure and things like that with my sound recordings. But as far as like, I'm not sure what he means by using it as a management or a mitigation tool, or the fact that I think keeping vegetation close to roads and having more natural trees and shrubs and things like that is a very important thing.
Mike, if you want to clarify your question a little bit, we'll wait for a second. That was the last question that we had in there, and so I would, if anybody has another question, go ahead and throw it into the chat now. But in the meantime, I want to thank you very much for your presentation and for all the time you took to develop such a nice presentation. And in our virtual world of speakers, we can't hear any applause. So if you guys would like to send any verbal applause or comments for Tim, go ahead and do that now. And then also tell us where you're from. It's very interesting to see how far our outreach went in order to keep doing these. But I'd also like to thank AWA members who make these presentations possible. We're a local nonprofit. We rely heavily on membership donations to make our programs, especially Wildlife Wednesdays work. We work really hard to keep these events free and open to everybody and to make them family friendly. And we've been able to do that because of your support, so thank you. If you're not an AWA member, I'm just gonna throw out into the chat, hold on real quick. If you're interested in joining Alaska Wildlife Alliance, go to our secure online platform, and I put the information or our mailing address in there. If you're interested in just going to our website, I also put our website information into the chat, and then akbnp.org for beluga monitoring. But beyond that, thank you very much. If you're interested in donating to Alaska Wildlife, we have secure donation platforms through Pick, Click, Give, through Amazon Smile, through the Roundup app, through Bonfire, and through CFC. Any last words, Dr. Mullet?
I'm just overwhelmed by the wonderful comments. It really touches my heart. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and feel free to, I think my contact information is on that first slide. So once this goes out to, and you have access to it another time, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to answer any more questions and lead you on to other things if you need to.
All right, thank you. I'm going to, at this point, pause or stop the recording.